She threw the coins at Clara's feet. Not handed them. Threw them. "Pick them up," Mrs. Holt said loud enough for the whole shop to hear. "And then get out. We don't keep thieves here, especially not crippled ones." Every single person in that store looked at Clara Whitmore, and not one of them said a word. That was the moment Clara understood in this world, a woman like her did not get second chances. She only got closed doors. If this story moves you, please subscribe, drop a comment with your city, and stay with me until the very end. Let's see how far this story travels. The coins were still spinning on the wooden floor when Clara Whitmore bent down to pick them up. She moved slowly. She always moved slowly. Not because she was weak, because her left leg had never forgiven the accident that happened when she was 9 years old. The one where a horse-drawn cart slid on ice and pinned her beneath a wooden wheel for nearly an hour before anyone thought to pull it off. She was 9 years old. No one carried her to the doctor. A neighbor dragged her through the snow on a burlap sack. By the time someone set the bone, it had already started healing wrong. Clara was used to the way people looked at her when she walked. That quick flicker in their eyes, something between pity and discomfort before they looked away. As if watching her limp was something they had to suffer through. She picked up the coins one by one. Her fingers were steady. Her face was perfectly still. But inside her chest was doing what it always did in these moments, tightening like a fist around something fragile, trying very hard not to crush it completely. "I didn't steal anything, Mrs. Holt." Her voice came out quieter than she wanted it to. She hated that. She cleared her throat. "I didn't steal. The money you're missing is from last Tuesday's ledger. I told you the count was off when I handed it to you. You told me I was wrong." Mrs. Holt was a tall woman with a voice built for accusations. She crossed her arms and looked at Clara, the way a judge looks at a defendant she's already decided to hang. "Are you calling me a liar in my own shop?" "No, ma'am. I'm asking you to look at the ledger again." "I've looked at it." "Then you saw the discrepancy on Tuesday's entry." "What I saw," Mrs. Holt said, her voice rising, "was $3 missing and you standing next to the cash drawer. What I see right now is a woman who has been charity in this shop for 2 months and now has the nerve to argue with me." Charity. That word landed in Clara's stomach like a stone dropped into still water. She had worked 12-hour days in that shop. She had reorganized the entire thread inventory. She had repaired seams on wedding dresses that Mrs. Holt's other girls had given up on. She had done all of it standing on a leg that ached by noon and screamed by sundown. Charity. The other women in the shop, 4 of them girls. Clara had worked beside every day, kept their eyes on the floor. Not one of them spoke. Clara looked at each of their faces. Just for a moment. One last time. Then she straightened her back, tucked the coins into her apron pocket, and said the only thing she had left to say. "Then I suppose we are finished here." She walked out of Holt's sewing shop in Red Willow, Montana, on a Tuesday morning in October of 1887, with $1.47. To her name, a canvas bag with 2 spare dresses, a hairbrush and a small Bible that had belonged to her mother. She did not look back. She told herself that was strength. She was not entirely sure she believed it. To beg. Red Willow was the kind of small frontier town that remembered everything about a person and forgave nothing. There were 400 and some odd residents, 3 churches, 2 saloons, 1 doctor who drank too much, and an unspoken agreement among the townspeople that certain individuals were simply not meant to prosper. Clara Whitmore had been filed under that category since she was old enough to understand what categories were. She had tried the hotel laundry. Too slow on her feet, they said. She had tried the schoolhouse as a teacher's assistant. The children stared at her walk, they said. It was distracting. She had tried taking in mending at home, but home was a rented room above the blacksmith, and when Mr. Pruitt decided he needed the space for his cousin, he gave her 3 days' notice, and the kind of apologetic smile that people use when they have already decided they feel no real guilt. "You'll find something," he'd said. "You're a resourceful girl." Resourceful. That was the word people used for her when they didn't want to say unfortunate. She had been resourceful for 6 years. Since she was 18, and her The last family she had left passed away in the winter of 1881. Since then, Clara had moved through 11 different towns across Montana, looking for some version of a life that didn't feel like borrowed time. Red Willow had lasted the longest. 8 months. Long enough for her to start thinking foolishly that maybe this place was different. It wasn't. The wind off the mountains came early that October. By the time Clara had walked 3 miles out of town, she could feel it cutting through the wool of her coat, like the coat wasn't even there. Her bag had grown heavier with every mile, or maybe her arms had just grown weaker. She wasn't sure which. She stopped at a narrow creek crossing and set the bag down. She'd had half a biscuit for breakfast, nothing since. She looked at the water moving over the rocks and tried to make a plan. There was no plan to make. The next town was Harlan's Creek, 40 miles east. She had no horse. She had no cart. She had $1.47 and a leg that was already complaining loudly about the 3 miles she'd walked. She sat down on a flat rock beside the creek. She told herself she would rest for 10 minutes. Just 10. And then she put her face in her hands, and she let herself cry, the kind of crying she never let herself do in public. The ugly kind. The kind that started somewhere very deep and came up ragged and hard and honest. She cried for the room above the blacksmith. She cried for the 8 months she had believed in Red Willow. She cried for Mrs. Holt's voice saying charity like it was an insult. She cried for the 4 women who wouldn't meet her eyes. She cried for the little girl on the burlap sack in the snow. And then she stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She picked up her bag. She started walking again. She almost missed the ranch entirely. The road bent east toward Harlan's Creek, and Walker Ranch sat a half-mile off to the north on a track that wasn't much more than 2 ruts in the dirt. Clara would have walked right past it if her leg hadn't given out. It didn't buckle. It never buckled. But a sharp, deep pain shot from her hip to her knee, the kind that meant stop now or regret it later, and she grabbed the nearest fence post to steady herself. She stood there, one hand on the post, breathing through the pain, looking up the dirt track at a ranch she had never seen before. The fence post had a painted sign on it, weathered but still readable, Walker Ranch, N. Walker Prop. She'd heard the name. Everyone in Red Willow had. Nathaniel Walker was a man. People mentioned the way they mentioned weather, not always directly, but as context for everything else. Worst drought in years, even Walker's cattle are struggling. Big family from Billings wants to buy up land Walker won't sell. He was part of the landscape out here, a fixed point. She'd also heard the other things people said about him. Keeps to himself. Lost his fiancée years back. Never the same after. Quiet man. Hard man. Fair man if you do your work. Clara had not planned to come here. She had not planned anything beyond the next 10 minutes. But her leg was screaming, and the sun was already dropping toward the mountains, and $1.47 would not keep her warm through the night. She made a decision the way she'd learned to make most decisions in her life, not because she was confident, but because the alternative was worse. She turned off the main road and started up the dirt track toward Walker Ranch. She heard him before she saw him. A voice low even with that particular patience that men who work with animals tend to develop. Not soft exactly. More like controlled. Like a man who'd learned a long time ago that raising his voice solved very little. Easy. Easy. I know it hurts. I know. Stand still for me. Clara came around the side of the barn and stopped. Nathaniel Walker was crouched beside a brown horse that was clearly agitated, shifting its weight, tossing its head, and he had one hand flat on the animal's neck, not gripping, just resting there like he was trying to transfer something through his palm. He was tall, even crouching. Dark hair maybe a week past, needing a cut. Work clothes muddy at the knees. Late 30s, she guessed, with the kind of face that had been weathered rather than aged, not old, so much as settled. He hadn't heard her yet. Clara stood very still for a moment, watching him work. There was something in the way he handled the horse, the steadiness of it, the lack of performance that made her feel for just a second like she was watching something private. Then the horse shifted sideways and saw her, and that was that. Nathaniel looked up. His eyes went to her face first. She'd noticed that about him later, when she had time to think about it. That day, She just there, trying to look like a woman who hadn't spent the last hour crying beside a creek. "Can I help you?" Yes." She stepped forward. Her limp was worse when she was tired, and she was very tired. She watched his eyes waiting for the flicker. "I'm looking for work. Any kind of work. I can cook, keep accounts, mend, organize. I'm a hard worker. I don't complain and I don't ask for much." She'd given this speech so many times that it came out smooth, even when she felt anything but. Nathaniel Walker looked at her for a long moment. Not the flicker, not the pity. Just looking, like he was reading something. "What's your name?" "Clara Whitmore." "Where are you coming from, Miss Whitmore?" "Red Willow." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite recognition. More like he'd filed that information away next to something else he already knew. "Long walk," he said. "Yes." "That leg doing all right?" And there it was. She braced herself. The question always came, and then came what followed the question. The examination, the doubt, the careful recalculation of what she could and couldn't do, and the eventual polite refusal. "I manage," she said, keeping her voice flat. "I'm not asking if you manage," he said. "I'm asking if it's hurting you right now." Clara opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Yes," she said. Because it was, and because something in the directness of his question made lying feel pointless. "It hurts more when I'm tired." He stood up to his full height, still watching her. "When did you eat last?" "This morning." "What did you have?" "Half a biscuit." A long silence. "Come inside," he said. "We'll talk about work after you've eaten." Clara didn't move immediately. The offer was so simple, so without conditions, that she didn't quite know what to do with it. "I'm not looking for charity," she said. The word still sat ugly in her mouth from the morning. "I want to work for whatever I'm given." Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "I know that," he said. "That's why I said we'd talk about work. Right now I'm talking about supper. Come inside, Miss Whitmore." He turned and walked toward the house. After a moment, Clara followed him. The kitchen was the first room she saw of Walker Ranch, and she cataloged it the way she'd cataloged every space she'd ever occupied quickly, practically with an eye for what worked and what didn't. Old wood stove well used. Good iron pots, not enough of them. The counter needed scrubbing. The pantry door was hanging slightly off its upper hinge. A young man was sitting at the kitchen table when they came in, mid-20s, sandy-haired with the kind of easy grin that came from a life where things had generally gone his way. He looked up when they entered, and his eyes went immediately to Clara with open, uncomplicated curiosity. "Who's this?" "Her name's Clara Whitmore," Nathaniel said, moving to the stove. "She's looking for work. She hasn't eaten since this morning. Heat up what's left from lunch." The young man was already on his feet. He had the rangy energy of someone who was rarely still. "I'm James," he said, extending a hand across the table. "Nathaniel's my brother. I'm the better-looking one." "You're also the one who left a gate open last week and lost 4 horses," Nathaniel said from the stove. "I prefer to remember that differently." James grinned at Clara. "Don't let him scare you. He sounds like a thunderstorm, but he's mostly just wind." Nathaniel said nothing, which seemed to Clara like a very deliberate kind of patience. James heated up a pot of beef stew and cut bread and poured coffee without being asked twice, moving around the kitchen with the comfortable ease of someone who had lived there his whole life. Clara sat at the table and tried not to feel strange about it, about being given things, about the absence of conditions. She waited for the conditions to arrive. They didn't. "You said Red Willow," Nathaniel said, sitting across from her with his own coffee. "What happened there?" Clara looked up from the stew. "I was let go," she said carefully. "From where? Holt's sewing shop." Nathaniel's expression didn't change. "Mrs. Holt let you go." "She accused me of stealing." James, who had been about to sit down, stopped mid-motion. "Did you?" "James," Nathaniel said quietly. "It's a fair question." "No," Clara said, meeting James's eyes directly. "I didn't steal. There was an error in the ledger from the previous week. She blamed me for it." James sat down slowly, his grin gone, replaced with something more thoughtful. "That's a rotten thing to do to a person." "It happens," Clara said. "Shouldn't." "No," she agreed. "It shouldn't." She ate carefully, trying not to show how hungry she actually was. The stew was simple and good, and she had to remind herself to go slowly. She kept her hands steady. She kept her back straight. She was aware the whole time of Nathaniel Walker watching her. Not in the unsettling way some men watched women, but in the focused way he'd watched the horse. Reading something. Working something out. When she finished, she set her spoon down and looked at him directly. "What kind of help do you need?" she asked. He leaned back in his chair, his large hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Ranch house needs managing," he said. "We've been without anyone steady in the kitchen and on the books since early spring. The accounts are 6 months behind. I've got 14 ranch hands, and none of them cook worth a damn, including my brother." "I can cook," Clara said. "And I can keep accounts." "What else?" "Organizing, scheduling supplies, keeping track of what we need before we run out of it." He paused. "Physical labor is limited on the ranch house side. The hands do the outside work." He said it matter-of-factly, not as a kindness, more like information. "My leg doesn't stop me from doing most things," Clara said, and she said it evenly without apology. "There are some things I'm slower at. I don't hide that." "I'm not asking you to," Nathaniel said. Another silence. "I can offer you room and board," he said. "And a fair wage. $4 a week to start, more if the work warrants it. You'd have the back room off the kitchen. It's small, but it's warm. If you decide after a week that it's not what you want, you can leave without owing anything." $4 a week was more than Mrs. Holt had paid her. The room was more than she'd had in 2 years that felt like hers. Clara looked at this man, this quiet, weathered, direct man, and tried to find the catch in the offer. The pity. The agenda. The thing he wanted that he wasn't saying. She couldn't find it, which frightened her more than any of the things she usually found. "Why?" she asked. Nathaniel's eyebrow went up a fraction. "Why what? Why are you offering this to someone you've known for 20 minutes? He looked at her for a long moment. "Because the ranch needs managing, and you need a place," he said. "It's not more complicated than that." James, quiet for the past few minutes, let out a small breath that might have been a laugh. Clara looked at the table, at her empty bowl, at her worn hands. "I'll start tomorrow," she said, "if that suits you. Tonight if you need to rest first." "I don't need to rest," she said automatically. Nathaniel stood carrying his cup to the counter. "Then we'll start tomorrow," he said, as if she hadn't just contradicted him. "James will show you the back room." He walked out of the kitchen without another word. James looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, half amusement, half something softer. "Don't take the quiet personally," he said. "He's like that with everybody, has been for years." He stood and picked up her bag before she could reach for it. "Come on, I'll show you the room." Clara followed him down the short hallway, and when she stepped into the back room, small, yes, as advertised, but clean, with a real bed and a window and a small iron hook on the wall for hanging things. She stood in the middle of it and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she barely recognized it. Safe. She was not sure she trusted it. She was not sure she trusted any of this. But she sat on the edge of the bed, and she pressed her palms flat against the wool blanket, and she let herself breathe. Outside the window, she could hear the last sounds of the ranch settling into evening men calling to each other, horses shifting in the barn, the distant rhythm of something that felt very faintly like a world that ran on its own terms and might have room in it for her. She told herself not to count on it. She told herself she'd learned that lesson enough times. She told herself a lot of things. And then she lay down on the bed with her coat still on and fell asleep before she could argue herself out of staying. The morning came hard and cold, the way October mornings in Montana always did. Clara was up before anyone. That was deliberate. She needed to see the kitchen alone before anyone saw her in it. She needed to understand what she was working with, what was stocked, what was missing, what needed fixing, what could be salvaged. She needed to build her own map of the space before anyone could watch her do it. The pantry situation was better than she'd expected and worse than she'd hoped. Good stores of dried beans, flour, salt, cornmeal, and coffee. Sugar was low. They were almost out of baking powder. There were eggs, which meant chickens, which meant a daily supply she could rely on. The stove was in good shape, just needed the grate cleaned. She found the account ledger in a wooden box on the kitchen shelf. She sat down with it and her coffee and read through 6 months of entries. 30 minutes later, she set it down with the careful deliberateness of a woman who did not want to throw it across the room. It wasn't a ledger so much as a conversation a man had been having with mathematics and losing. Entries is in 3 different handwritings. Numbers crossed out and rewritten. Columns that didn't add up. At least 2 months where the same supply order appeared to have been paid twice. She was so absorbed in it that she didn't hear Nathaniel until he was standing in the kitchen doorway. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." He looked at the ledger on the table, then at her. "How bad is it?" "I've seen worse," Clara said. But it will take me about a week to sort it out properly." She turned a page. "You've been paying the feed supplier twice every other month." A pause. "For how long?" "At least since April." She ran her finger down a column. "Possibly longer. I'd need to pull the receipts." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a box of receipts in the bottom drawer of my desk. I'll need to see them. I'll get them after breakfast." He moved to the stove. "Do you want more coffee?" She looked up. I know you can," he said simply. "I'm asking if you want more." Clara blinked. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He poured her coffee and his own and sat down across from her, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was, she realized slowly, not uncomfortable. Just quiet. The particular quiet of 2 people who were each used to being alone and had not yet decided what to do with the presence of another. From outside, she heard James's voice already at full volume, despite the hour arguing cheerfully with one of the ranch hands about something involving a saddle. "Your brother is very," she started, "loud. I was going to say present." The smallest possible curve came to the corner of Nathaniel's mouth. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "That's generous of you," he said. And Clara found to her mild surprise that she almost smiled back. The ranch hands were the next test. There were 14 of them, ranging from a teenager named Pete, who was still growing into his boots, to a barrel-chested man of 50 named Hector, who had worked the ranch longer than anyone and possessed an opinion on every subject known to man. They filed into the kitchen for breakfast in shifts, the early crew first, then the second, and each of them made their own calculation when they saw Clara. She watched them do it. She'd gotten good at reading that calculation. Some landed on curiosity, some on doubt, 1 or 2 on something more hostile. The hostile one made his thoughts known before he'd even sat down. His name was Russ. Tall, lean, with eyes that seemed to have decided not to trust her the moment they saw her limp. "Nate, finally hire a cook," he said loud enough for the table to hear. "Looks like," said Pete. Russ looked at Clara directly. "You gonna be able to carry those pots?" Clara set a full pot of oatmeal on the table without looking at him. "Just did," she said. A couple of the men tried to hide grins. Russ's eyes narrowed, but he sat down. Hector at the end of the table helped himself to oatmeal and nodded at her once. It was the kind of nod that meant, "I'm withholding judgment, but I'm not starting from hostility." She'd take it, after breakfast. When the men had gone back to their work, James appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man delivering news. He found funny. "You know Russ made a bet that you'd be gone inside 2 weeks. What are the odds he's offering?" Clara asked, scrubbing the pot. James blinked, then burst out laughing. "I'll ask him." "Don't bother, just let him be wrong on his own schedule." James leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. He was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that she looked up. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "Why'd you really come here? And I don't mean the practical answer. I mean the real one." Clara looked at him. He was young, but his eyes were older than his grin. Perceptive, she thought. More perceptive than he let on. Because I ran out of other options, she said honestly. That's the practical answer. She was quiet for a moment, her hands still in the wash water. Because I needed to find out, she said finally, if there was somewhere that would let me just be useful without making me feel like a problem they were solving. James was quiet. And, he said. It's been one morning, Clara said. Ask me again in a week. He smiled at that, a real smile without performance. Fair enough. He pushed off the doorframe and headed back toward the door, and then paused. For what it's worth, he said, not looking back. My brother doesn't do things out of pity. Never has. It's not in him. He left before she could respond. Clara stood in the quiet kitchen and turned that sentence over in her mind. Doesn't do things out of pity. She wasn't sure yet whether to believe it, but she filed it carefully away in the part of herself that was still, despite everything, paying attention. The week passed faster than she expected, not because it was easy. Her first full day on the accounts left her with a headache that lasted through supper. The kitchen ran on its own chaotic rhythm that she spent 3 days learning before she could start changing. The ranch hands were a separate language entirely, their schedules, their preferences, the particular politics of who could eat next to whom without trouble. But she learned it. She always learned it. By the end of the week, the ledger had been reconciled through July. She'd written a letter to the feed supplier about the double payments and received a curt but honest acknowledgement back. The kitchen ran on a schedule now: breakfast at 5:30, noon meal at 12, supper at 6, and the men had adapted to it with the resigned practicality of people who understood that things ran better with structure, even when structure wasn't their preference. Nathaniel reviewed the ledger on Saturday evening without comment. Then he said, "The August and September accounts are in the same box." "I know. I'll start on them Monday." A pause. "Good work," he said. Clara looked up. He said it the way he seemed to say everything, without decoration, without performance. It was not a compliment designed to make her feel good. It was an assessment, an honest one. She found that she preferred it to every effusive, apologetic, guilt-softened compliment she had ever received from people who felt sorry for her. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and left. Clara sat alone with the ledger and the evening light and the quiet sounds of the ranch outside, and she held on to that moment, good work, and let it mean something. She told herself not to need it too much. She told herself that plenty of times over the days and weeks that followed. The first real crisis came in the second week. It wasn't dramatic. Ranch crises rarely were at first. They announced themselves as small problems. A fence section down on the east pasture. 3 horses escaped before anyone noticed. By the time the full picture was clear, the problem had doubled. Clara found out about it, not from Nathaniel or James, but from the sound of raised voices outside the barn, the particular quality of men's voices when a bad situation was still being argued about instead of solved. She stepped out. Russ was in the middle of it, as she might have predicted. "We need every hand on the east pasture now," he was saying. "Leave the other work." "We can't leave the supply delivery," said a younger hand named Sam. "That's 2 hours away and they won't hold it. The pasture comes first." "The pasture can wait 20 minutes. "It cannot wait 20 minutes. The horses are." "Excuse me." Clara's voice was not loud, but it had the particular quality of clarity that cuts through noise. Every man turned. She looked at Russ, then at Sam, then at the rest of them. "How many horses are loose?" "3, said Sam. "How far out?" "East pasture's about 1.5 miles. They haven't crossed the ridge." "Then they're still on Walker land." She turned to Sam. "You and Pete go handle the supply delivery. It takes 20 minutes. You'll be back before the horses reach the ridge." She turned to the rest. "Hector, you know the east pasture better than anyone. Take 4 men, go. Now move east and push them toward the north gate. Don't chase them, push them." She looked at Russ last. "You know how to fix fence?" A beat. "Yes," he said with considerably less volume than usual. "Then take 2 men and go fix it so this doesn't happen again in an hour." Nobody moved for about 3 seconds. Then Hector picked up his hat and headed for the east pasture. After that, everyone moved. Clara turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Behind her, she heard James's voice, quiet and amused. "I want to know what Russ's face looks like right now. I bet it's something." She did not smile until she was back inside. But then she smiled. Nathaniel heard about it that evening. He came to the kitchen after supper when Clara was finishing the final entries in the August ledger. He sat down across from her the way he'd been doing more and more in the evenings. "Hector told me what happened this afternoon," he said. "The horses are back in the pasture," Clara said, not looking up from the ledger. "The fence is repaired. The delivery came in on time." "That's not what I'm talking about." She looked up. "You organized 14 men in about 90 seconds, he said. "Men who have been doing this work for years." "I organized 6 men, she corrected. "And I just asked them to do what they already knew how to do." Nathaniel looked at her. "Most people," he said slowly, "who've been treated the way you have, they spend all their energy just trying to prove they deserve to be in the room." Clara held very still. "You don't do that," he said. "You just do the work, as if you already know your place here." She didn't know how to answer that. The truth was more complicated than it looked. The truth was that she was still waiting every single day for the moment someone told her the place was no longer hers. That she had been tried out and found insufficient. That there was some reason she hadn't anticipated that would require her to pick up her bag and leave. She was still keeping her bag packed. She hadn't admitted that to anyone. "I know how to work," she said finally. "That's all." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "That's not all," he said. He stood and left, and Clara sat with the ledger and the lamp and the strange, unsettled weight of those 3 words. "That's not all." She pressed her hands flat on the table. She made herself breathe. She told herself this place was temporary, that she should not care too much, that every time she had cared too much, it had ended the same way. Outside, the Montana night settled in, vast and cold and indifferent, and Clara Whitmore sat in a warm kitchen in a house that was not hers, doing work that she was good at, and tried very hard not to want to stay. She was not entirely successful. And somewhere deeper down, in a place she hadn't let herself look at in years, something small and cautious and stubborn as a seed in frozen ground, was starting to wake up. The bag was still packed. Clara hadn't moved it from the corner of the back room. Every morning she woke up and looked at it, the canvas handles worn soft from years of use, the small leather buckle she'd repaired twice with thread and stubbornness, and every morning she made the same quiet decision: not yet. Stay one more day, see what the day brings. That was how she'd been living for 3 weeks now, one day at a time. Like a woman standing on ice she wasn't sure would hold. The problem was, it kept holding, and that scared her more than the alternative. She was in the middle of reconciling September's accounts on a Thursday morning when James came into the kitchen with mud on his boots and the expression of a man who had just witnessed something worth reporting. "Russ just told Hector that you've got a better head for numbers than any man he's ever worked for," he said, dropping into the chair across from her. Clara didn't look up. "Is that what he said?" Well, what he actually said was more like, "That woman's going to tell Nathaniel he's been losing money for 5 years, and Nathaniel's going to find out she's right." James picked up an apple from the bowl on the table. "I'm paraphrasing in your favor." "I noticed. Still, coming from Russ, that's practically a marriage proposal." Clara set her pen down and looked at him. "Your brother has been overpaying for cattle feed, underbilling for grazing rights on the south pasture, and missing a tax credit on the equipment purchased in March. In total, this ranch has lost the equivalent of about 4 months' profit in the last year alone. That's not a compliment to me. That's a problem that needed fixing." James stared at her. 4 months, he said. "Approximately." He put the apple down. "Nathaniel doesn't know this yet. He will tonight." A pause. "Should I be somewhere else tonight?" James asked carefully. "That's up to you." He picked the apple back up, looked at it, set it down again. "You know," he said, "most people, when they find out something like that about the man who hired them, they'd soften it. Find a way to say it that doesn't sound so accurate. I was going to say blunt." Clara looked at him steadily. Your brother is a grown man running a serious operation. If I soften the numbers to protect his feelings, I'm not doing my job. I'm just being polite at his expense." James was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. "You know, you're the first person I've seen in a long time who talks to Nathaniel like he's just a person." Clara frowned. "He is just a person. Most people don't treat him that way. They're either afraid of him or they're trying to get something from him." He shrugged. "It's different, that's all I mean." He left shortly after, and Clara sat with that for a while, the weight of it, the strange shape of it, before she picked her pen back up and went back to the numbers. She was very good at going back to the numbers. Numbers, at least, didn't surprise her. That evening, Nathaniel sat across from her at the kitchen table and read through what she'd prepared. He didn't speak for a long time. The lamp between them made the shadows move. Outside, the wind was picking up the way it did most October nights in Montana, insistent like something that wanted in. Clara watched his face. She'd gotten better at reading it in the weeks she'd been here. It wasn't expressive in the way James's was. Nothing moved across it quickly or without decision. But there were small things. The way the muscle in his jaw tightened when he was processing something difficult. The way he breathed out slowly through his nose when he was holding back a reaction. Both of those things were happening right now. "The South Pasture billing," he said finally. "You've been charging the Hendersons the old rate from 1883. The market rate now is almost double. The Hendersons have been grazing there since my father's time. I know. You can still give them a better rate than market if you want. That's your decision. I'm just telling you what the actual number is." He looked at the page. "And the tax credit. You'd need to file an amended return for March. It's within the window. The credit is on equipment purchased for agricultural expansion. The new water troughs qualify. It's about $40. $40? Yes." He set the papers down and leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "When my father died," he said, not looking at her, "he left me this ranch with a handshake from the bank and a ledger that was in better shape than mine is right now." A pause. "I've been running this place for 11 years. Clara didn't say anything. "I built the herd up, fixed the fences, hired good men." Another pause. "I thought I was managing well." "You were managing the outside," Clara said quietly. "The inside got away from you. That happens." He looked at her. "Does it happen to you?" The question landed differently than she expected. More personal, more direct. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Sometimes the thing you're least able to look at clearly is the thing that's right in front of you." A long silence. "How long to get the books clean?" he asked. "Another 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the October receipts are as tangled as September's." "They're worse." "Of course they are." She gathered the papers into a neat stack. "I'll start on them tomorrow." Nathaniel stood. He picked up his coffee cup and carried it to the counter, and then he stood there for a moment with his back to her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Clara." A beat. "Clara." He didn't turn around. "I want you to know whatever happened in Red Willow, whatever Mrs. Holt said about you, she was wrong." Clara's hands went still on the papers. "I'm not saying that to make you feel better," he continued, still not turning. "I'm saying it because I've watched you work for 3 weeks, and I know the difference between a person who steals and a person who was stolen from." The silence afterward was the kind that has weight to it. "Thank you," Clara said, and her voice for just a moment lost its careful steadiness. He nodded once and left the kitchen. Clara sat very still for a long time. Then she went and looked at the packed bag in the corner of her room. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she thought about unpacking it. She didn't do it yet, but she thought about it. The first crack in Russ's hostility appeared on a Tuesday, and it happened because of a horse, one of the younger animals. A gray mare named Silver, that Pete had taken particular interest in, had been favoring her right foreleg for 2 days. Pete was worried. Russ had looked at it and declared it a mild strain and told Pete to stop coddling the animal. Pete had looked unconvinced but said nothing because Russ had 20 years on him and the particular authority that comes from never appearing to doubt yourself. Clara had watched the mare that morning from the kitchen window. The way she shifted her weight. The way she stood. At noon, she went out to the barn. Pete was there, which she'd expected. Russ was there too, which she hadn't. "What are you doing out here?" Russ said. Not hostile exactly, more territorial. "Looking at the mare," Clara said. "She's fine." "Can I see her foreleg?" "I already looked at it." "I'd like to look at it too." Russ stared at her for a moment. Then, with the expression of a man humoring a person he finds mildly irritating, he stepped back. Clara crouched beside the mare. She ran her hand slowly down the foreleg, feeling the shape of it, the temperature. Pete watched her from 2 feet away, with barely concealed hope. She found what she was looking for, about 4 inches above the fetlock. "There's a small wound here," she said. "Very small. You'd miss it in the hair. But it's deep enough to be infected." She looked up at Russ. "If it's not cleaned and treated today, she'll be lame in this leg by the weekend." Silence. "I didn't see any wound," Russ said. "You weren't looking for one," Clara said without accusation. "You were looking for a strain." Pete crouched beside her, looking where she'd indicated. "I see it," he said quietly. "Right there." Another silence. "Can you treat it?" Pete asked her. "I can clean it. You'll need to keep it bandaged and watch for fever." She stood slowly, her leg protesting the crouching position. "Do you have carbolic acid in the supply room?" "Should have," Pete said, already moving. Russ stood very still as Pete went for the supplies. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "My uncle raised horses," Clara said, "before the accident." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things about her leg, when she chose to mention it at all. "Infected wound hides in the hair. You have to feel for the heat, not just look for the swelling." Russ was quiet for a long moment. "I would have caught it by tomorrow," he said. But he said it without the usual edge, and they both knew what that meant. "Probably," Clara agreed. And she let it go at that. She treated the mare. Pete helped. Russ, after a minute, handed her the bandaging without being asked. It wasn't an apology. Men like Russ didn't deliver apologies directly. They came sideways, through actions, through small, unsolicited helps, through the gradual disappearance of obstruction. But it was something. Walking back to the kitchen afterward, Clara felt the warmth of it, careful and brief, like putting her hands near a fire she wasn't sure she was allowed to sit beside. The thing about James Walker was that he was harder to keep at a distance than she'd expected. Most people. When Clara didn't encourage conversation, took the hint. James appeared constitutionally incapable of taking hints. He came into the kitchen at random hours, ate whatever was available with enthusiastic gratitude, told stories about ranch disasters that somehow always ended with him looking more foolish than heroic, and asked her questions with the easy openness of someone who had never learned that personal questions could be unwelcome. She should have found it exhausting. She found it against her better judgment, something like companionable. One afternoon in the 4th week, he came in after a long day, looking genuinely beaten down, which was unusual enough for James that she noticed it immediately. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing." He sat down heavily. "Everything's fine." "James." He looked up. She raised an eyebrow. He deflated. "I wrote a letter to a woman in Billings about 6 weeks ago," he said. "Her name's Catherine. I met her at the county fair in August. She was something." He picked at a thread on his sleeve. "She wrote back 3 weeks ago, and I just now got to reading the whole thing, and she's engaged to someone else, has been since July." Clara set down what she was doing. "I know it's stupid," James said quickly. "I only met her twice. I just thought—" He stopped. "I just thought something was there." "Maybe something was," Clara said. "That doesn't make it less real." He looked at her. "You've had that, something that didn't—" "Everyone's had that," she said. "Being foolish about someone isn't limited to people who have more favorable circumstances than mine." James was quiet for a moment. Then, "Nathaniel would tell me to work it off." "Nathaniel is not wrong," Clara said. "But there's also nothing wrong with sitting with it for a while first." James looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Something like gratitude, but softer. More surprised. "You're a better listener than Nathaniel," he said. Your brother listens, Clara said. He just doesn't always fill the silence afterward. That's different from not listening. James tilted his head. You've thought about him a fair amount. I work with him, Clara said, returning to what she'd been doing. I pay attention to the people I work with. It's practical. James said it in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Clara chose not to address the implication. She was very good at choosing not to address implications. What she couldn't choose not to notice was how Nathaniel changed incrementally over those first weeks, not dramatically. Nothing about Nathaniel Walker happened dramatically. It was more like watching a tightly wound mechanism slowly release tension, not collapsing, but easing. He started stopping by the kitchen in the mornings, not just for coffee, but to talk through the day's plans. Not to ask her input exactly, more like thinking out loud with someone he'd decided he could trust to think alongside him. Hector says we should rotate the south herd to the upper pasture before the first hard frost, he said one morning. But the upper pasture needs the fence on the west side replaced first. How long for the fence? Clara asked. 2 days if we put 3 men on it. And the frost? Week and a half, maybe. Then you have time for the fence, she said. Barely, but you have it. He nodded, drank his coffee, stood to leave. Do you always think this way? He asked, pausing at the door. What way? Like every problem is just a sequence of steps. Clara considered that. I don't know how else to think about them. He looked at her for a moment. Where did you learn that? Survival, she said simply. I didn't say anything to that. But he stood there a beat longer than he needed to before he left. And Clara noticed. She noticed, and she told herself it meant nothing, and she was beginning to suspect that she was lying to herself. The twist came on a Saturday morning, and it came in the form of a visitor Clara hadn't expected. She was in the kitchen when she heard wheels on the dirt road, a buggy by the sound of it, not a wagon. Through the window she saw it pull up, and she saw the woman who stepped out of it, and something in her chest went very quiet and very still. The woman was beautiful. That was simply a fact, the way mathematical facts are facts. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair arranged perfectly under a traveling hat, wearing clothes that cost more than Clara made in 3 months. She moved with the assurance of someone who had never once walked into a room and wondered if she was welcome. She was looking at the house with an expression Clara could not quite read from the window. James appeared from the direction of the barn and stopped dead when he saw her. And then the woman said loud enough for Clara to hear through the window glass, "James, is Nathaniel here? I need to speak with him." Clara watched James's face go through several things very quickly. He said something Clara couldn't hear. The woman said something back. James's expression settled into something careful and unhappy. Then he went to get Nathaniel. Clara should have stayed in the kitchen. She knew that. She stayed in the kitchen. She also stood close enough to the window to hear what happened next. Nathaniel came around from the side of the house and stopped when he saw her. Clara watched his face from the distance of the window, watched the stillness that came over it. Not the normal stillness, but a different kind. The kind that meant something was being locked down hard and fast. "Miriam," he said. Just the name. Nothing else. The woman. Miriam took a step toward him. "Nathaniel, I know this is unexpected." "It is." "I've been in Billings for the past month. I heard things are going well with the ranch. I wanted to—" She paused. "I wanted to see you." "You had 4 years to see me," Nathaniel said. His voice was completely even. That particular evenness that Clara had come to recognize as the thing his voice did when he was keeping a very strong feeling at a very controlled distance. "I know that." Miriam's voice was softer now. "I know. I made a mistake, Nathaniel. You know I made a mistake. Edward and I that ended 18 months ago. I've been—" She stopped again. "Can we talk properly?" A long pause. Clara realized she was holding her breath. She made herself breathe. "James," Nathaniel said. "Please take Miss Whitmore into town if she needs anything from the supply store today." James's voice very carefully. "She doesn't need anything from James. A beat." "Right," James said. "Yes, Sure. Clara stepped back from the window before either of them could look toward the kitchen. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at her hands. She had no right to feel what she was feeling. She catalogued that fact carefully. She felt it anyway. James appeared in the kitchen doorway 5 minutes later, wearing an expression of pure, helpless apology. "You heard," he said. "Enough." "Clara." "It's fine," she said. "Is there anything we actually need from town?" "Clara." "James?" She looked at him. "Is there anything we need?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Coffee," he said finally. "We're low on sugar too." "Then let's go." She got her coat from the hook. She did not look toward the front of the house as they drove away in the supply wagon. She looked at the road ahead, and she kept her face exactly the way she wanted it, calm, practical, arranged. And she thought about Miriam's beautiful certainty. The way she'd moved toward Nathaniel without hesitation. The way she'd said, "I made a mistake," like the mistake was a thing that could simply be undone, because for women like her, it often could be. She thought about the packed bag in the corner of the back room. She'd been thinking about unpacking it. Maybe she thought she had been thinking about something very foolish. James did not try to make conversation on the road into town, which meant he understood more than he let on, or possibly more than she'd given him credit for. It wasn't until they were on the way back, the wagon loaded, the afternoon going gray and cold around them, that he spoke. "Miriam Hastings," he said. "She and Nathaniel were engaged 4 years ago." "I know," Clara said. "You told me before." "Right." He was quiet. "She left him for Edward Hastings, a banker from Billings. More money than God and half the sense." He adjusted the reins. "Nathaniel didn't. He wasn't the same for a long time after that. He stopped talking much, started working twice as hard. That's what he does when something hurts. He goes quiet and he works." Clara said nothing. "He's not going to go back to her," James said. "That's not my business." "Clara." She looked at him. "It's all right to care about what happens," he said quietly. "You're allowed to care." She turned back to the road. Her jaw was tight. She made herself loosen it. "I have cared about things before," she said. "It has never protected me from losing them." James didn't answer that. There probably wasn't an answer to give. They drove the rest of the way in silence, and when they got back to the ranch, Miriam's buggy was gone. Clara unloaded the supplies. She put the coffee away, and the sugar, and the 2 tins of baking powder she'd added without telling James. She started on supper, because supper needed to happen, regardless of everything else. She was at the stove when Nathaniel came in. She didn't turn around. "Do you want coffee?" she asked. "There's fresh." A pause. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She poured it and set it on the table without looking at his face. She went back to the stove. "She's gone," he said. "I know. I told her there was nothing to return to." Clara's hand stilled on the spoon. She made herself keep stirring. "You don't have to explain anything to me," she said. "I know I don't." Another pause. "I'm telling you because you were here when she arrived and I didn't handle that well. Sending you into town like you were in the way." Now she turned around. Howe was sitting at the table with his coffee, and he looked tired. Not physically tired. The other kind. "You weren't wrong to want privacy," Clara said. "I wasn't trying to protect privacy." He looked at his cup. "I was trying to keep 2 things separate that I hadn't." He stopped, started again. "I didn't want her to see." "See what?" He looked up at her. "That I wasn't." He stopped again, and Clara had the strange sensation of watching a man try to say something for the first time that he had only ever thought in the dark and by himself. "That I wasn't waiting anymore," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at him steadily. Her heart was doing something she was choosing to ignore. "Nathaniel," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I know." He stood up and took his coffee and went back out. And Clara stood in this kitchen with the spoon in her hand, and the supper on the stove, and something large and terrifying and completely unwelcome opening itself up in the center of her chest. She was not going to do this, she told herself. She was not going to be the woman who believed in something like this, and then had it taken away from her. She had survived too much to hand herself over to a hope that fragile. She set the spoon down. She went and finished making supper. She served it, and she ate, and she cleaned up, and she went to the back room, and she stood in front of the packed bag. She looked at it for a long time. Then slowly, with hands that were only slightly unsteady, she unbuckled the leather strap. And she started to unpack. Not because she was certain, not because she had stopped being afraid, but because somewhere in the past 5 weeks, this place had stopped being a last resort, and she was done pretending she couldn't feel the difference. The bag was unpacked. That small act sat in Clara's chest every morning, like something she was still getting used to. The way a healed bone feels different from the original functional, but changed. She had folded her 2 spare dresses into the small drawer beside the bed. She had set her mother's Bible on the windowsill, where she could see it when she woke up. She had hung her hairbrush on the iron hook by the door. Small things, ordinary things, things that said I am staying. She had not said those words out loud to anyone. She didn't need to. The unpacked bag said it for her, and the only person who would have understood what it meant hadn't asked. But Nathaniel noticed. She knew he noticed because the morning after she'd done it, he'd come into the kitchen and looked at her with that steady reading quality in his eyes, not long, not obvious, and then simply said, "I'll be repairing the south fence line today. Should be back by 4. As if this information were something she needed to plan around. As if her plans were part of the calculation now. She'd said, "I'll have supper ready at 6. He'd nodded and left. That was all. It was more than she knew what to do with. 3 days later, on a cold Thursday morning in early November, Thomas Caldwell rode into Red Willow. Clara didn't know this yet. She was at the kitchen table going over the October accounts, which had proven to be, as Nathaniel predicted, worse than September's. She had her coffee, she had her pen, she had the particular focused quiet she'd learned to build around herself when she worked a wall of concentration that kept the rest of the world at a manageable distance. She did not know that 11 miles away, a man who had helped destroy her life once was about to try to do it again. The first sign was James, who came in at noon, wearing an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not his usual easy trouble. Something tighter. Something he was trying to decide how to say. "What?" Clara said without looking up. "How do you always—" He stopped. "There's talk in town." She looked up now. "What kind of talk?" James sat down. He pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands, which he only did when he was genuinely uncomfortable. "Thomas Caldwell's in Red Willow. Came in yesterday evening, apparently. He's been at the saloon since last night, and he's been talking." Clara set her pen down. The name landed in her chest, the way names do when they are attached to memory that hasn't finished hurting. Thomas Caldwell. 28 years old, son of Douglas Caldwell, who owned more land in this county than any 3 other families combined. A man who had learned early that his family name was a kind of currency that spent well anywhere he chose to use it. She had worked for Douglas Caldwell's household 2 years before Red Willow. She had kept accounts, organized the staff schedule, managed supply orders. She had done it well for 4 months, and then Thomas had decided she had seen something she shouldn't have: an arrangement between his father's books and a supplier that did not survive honest scrutiny. And rather than address what she'd seen, he'd simply made her untrustworthy. It was elegant in its way. He hadn't needed to fabricate much. A woman with a limp, no family, no roots. A woman who moved from town to town. All he had to add was the suggestion of dishonesty. And the suggestion was enough. Mrs. Holt's accusation in Red Willow had not been unprompted. Clara had suspected that for months. Now she was certain. "What is he saying?" she asked. Her voice was flat and even. She had practiced making her voice flat and even when something underneath it was not. James looked pained. "That you followed Nathaniel out here. That you manufactured a situation to get hired. That the whole thing with Holt's shop was—" He stopped. "That you staged it, to make yourself look like a victim." The silence after that was very complete. Clara looked at her hands on the table. "He's saying I planned it," she said. "Yes. That I deliberately lost my job and walked 4 miles in the cold with a bad leg, and $1.47 to my name as part of a scheme to manipulate a man I had never met. James's jaw tightened. I know how it sounds. Does anyone believe it? How was quiet a half-second too long. James, some people, he said carefully. It's Caldwell. His family has weight in this county. People don't always weigh what he says against what's logical. They weigh it against what it costs them to disagree with him. Clara stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there with her back to James, and she pressed her hand flat against the wall because she needed to feel something solid. He won't stop at talk, she said. He never does. Nathaniel's going to want to know about this, James said. I know. Clara, Nathaniel can handle Caldwell. He's not. This isn't about what Nathaniel can handle, she said. She turned around. This is about what it costs him to handle it. A man like Caldwell doesn't just damage the person he's targeting. He damages everyone around them. The association becomes the problem. Nathaniel doesn't care about. He should care, Clara said. He has a business. He has a reputation he's built for 11 years. He has men who depend on him. She felt the old pain moving through her, familiar and terrible, like a current she'd been swimming against her whole life. I've done this before. I've watched what happens when I stay somewhere that I've been marked. It doesn't end with me. It spreads. James stood up. Then we tell him, and we let him decide. And if he decides I should stay, then you stay. And when Caldwell escalates, when it isn't just talk, when it's his father calling in favors, pulling contracts, telling people who do business with Walker Ranch that there's a question about the woman managing the books. James looked at her. Clara, he said quietly, you're already writing the ending. She turned back to the window. I've read this story before, she said. I know how it ends. Maybe, James said, you haven't read this version. He left to find Nathaniel. And Clara stood in the kitchen and tried to decide whether that was something she could afford to believe. Nathaniel came in from the far pasture within the hour. James must have ridden out to him because he came in still carrying the cold of the outdoors on his coat and his face. When he looked at Clara, had that locked-down quality she'd learned to read. He was angry, not at her. She could tell the difference now, the direction anger pointed in his eyes, which way it was aimed. Tell me what you know about Caldwell, he said. So she told him. She told him the whole thing. The Caldwell household, the accounts, what she'd seen, and what had followed. She told it plainly, without softening it, without editorial. Just the sequence of events laid out the way she laid out ledger entries. This happened, then this, then this. When she finished, Nathaniel was quiet. The muscle in his jaw was doing the thing it did. He ran you out of 2 towns, he said. Effectively, yes. And you think he came here because someone told him where I was, Clara said. Someone in Red Willow. Probably Mrs. Holt. She and the Caldwell family have done business for years. Nathaniel stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood exactly where she'd stood an hour ago, which she noticed and didn't remark on. What do you want to do? He asked. The question stopped her. Not what should we do. Not here's what I think we should do. What do you want to do? I don't know that anyone has asked me that before in a situation like this, she said honestly. He turned. I'm asking. She looked at him. At this man who had looked at her from the first moment and seen something other than her limp, other than the weight of what she carried, other than the convenient story of a woman who needed saving. I want to stay, she said. I want to keep doing the work I'm doing. I want. She stopped. What? I want to stop being a problem that other people have to solve. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. You're not a problem. Caldwell will make me one. Caldwell, Nathaniel said, has been making himself other people's problems since he was old enough to trade on his father's name. He's not new to me. He moved back to the table. He's not going to come near this ranch without my knowing about it. And if he talks in town, people will listen to him, Clara said. That's what I'm telling you. It doesn't matter what the truth is. It matters to me, Nathaniel said. It matters to me too, Clara said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word which she hated. She pressed on through it. That's why I'm telling you this might not be worth what it costs you." The silence stretched. Clara. He said her name the way he'd been saying it for weeks without decoration, just the two syllables but with a weight underneath them that she'd been carefully pretending not to hear. "Look at me." She looked at him. "I am going to say something to you, and I need you to actually hear it, not just file it away and argue with it later when you're alone." She waited. "You are not a liability to this ranch," he said. "You are not a problem I am tolerating. You have done more for the operation of this place in 6 weeks than the last 3 years combined. Every man out there respects you. The books are clean for the first time since my father ran this place. And you have not once, not one time, asked for more than what was fair." He stopped. Then, "I don't want you to leave. I am not asking you to leave. And I am not going to let Thomas Caldwell walk into this county and rewrite what I know to be true." Clara felt the words go through her like something physical. She had been waiting. She realized it only now standing here. She had been waiting for weeks for this to crack. For the version of this she'd seen before, where the kindness turned out to have a ceiling, where the offer turned out to have conditions, where the man who'd seemed different turned out to be the same. He wasn't cracking. "All right," she said finally. "All right. All right?" She sat back down. She picked up her pen. "Then I need to finish the October accounts." Something moved across Nathaniel's face that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Good," he said. He went back out. Clara stared at the ledger and did not process a single number for 4 full minutes. Caldwell made his next move 3 days later, and he made it cleverly, the way men like him always did, not directly. Not where it could be clearly attributed, but sideways through channels that kept his hands appearing clean. The feed supplier sent a message to Walker Ranch saying there was a question about the account, a discrepancy they needed to review in person. Nathaniel went into town to deal with it and came back 2 hours later with a flat, controlled expression that Clara had learned to read as fury being held at arm's length. "There was no discrepancy," he said. "I know," Clara said. "I reconciled that account myself. Someone told Briggs, the supplier, that there was a question about who had authorized the recent payment corrections. That the person managing the accounts might not have proper authority." He paused. "He wanted to confirm I was aware of the changes." "Meaning someone told him the changes were made without your knowledge," Clara said. "Yes." She felt cold. "He's not going after me directly," she said. "He's going after the work. If he can make the accounts suspicious, he makes me suspicious. And if he can do it through third parties, you can't confront him about it without looking like you're overreacting." "I know what he's doing," Nathaniel said. "I've written a letter to Briggs confirming your authority on the accounts. He accepted it without question. He's not an enemy, just a cautious man who didn't want trouble." He set his hat on the table. "But this isn't going to be the last move he makes." "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't." James appeared in the doorway. He'd been in town that afternoon, and by his face, he'd heard something. "Spit it out," Nathaniel said. "Caldwell's been talking to the Hendersons," James said, "about the grazing rate change." Nathaniel went very still. Clara had sent the revised billing to the Hendersons the previous week, a new rate still below market, but corrected from the 1883 number they'd been paying for years. She'd written the letter, carefully explained the adjustment, reasonably offered a payment schedule if needed. "What's he saying?" Clara asked. "That you pressured Nathaniel into ripping up a long-standing agreement," James said. "That you're systematically restructuring the ranch's relationships to consolidate your own position." He looked between them. "Old man Henderson's not happy. He's talking about pulling the grazing arrangement entirely." The grazing arrangement with the Hendersons was worth nearly $200 a year to Walker Ranch. Clara stood up from the table. "I need to write another letter." "Clara, no. I need to address it directly in writing with numbers. Show him what the old rate was, what market rate is what I offered, and why the offer was still below market by 30%. She was already moving to the desk. "If Henderson's a reasonable man, he'll see it. If Caldwell's already gotten to him too deeply, the letter won't fix it, but it creates a record, something concrete that can't be reframed later." Nathaniel watched her move to the desk. "Do it," he said. She wrote it in 20 minutes, clean and factual and unanswerable. James took it into town before dark. Henderson wrote back the following morning the arrangement would stand. He appreciated the explanation. He was sorry for the confusion. It should have felt like a victory. It felt like a warning shot that had missed by inches, because Caldwell was learning the shape of the thing he was trying to break, and he was adjusting his aim. The next blow came from a direction Clara had not expected, and it came wearing a face she recognized. Margaret Pruitt, the wife of the man who had put Clara out of her rented room above the blacksmith, came to Walker Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon with a basket of preserves and the manner of a woman making a social call. She was round-faced and pleasant, and had always seemed to Clara like someone who was essentially kind, but operated primarily by the guidelines of whoever was loudest in her immediate vicinity. Clara came to the door. Margaret's expression, when she saw Clara, was complicated, something genuine and something rehearsed living side by side in her face. "Clara," she said, "you look well." "Mrs. Pruitt?" Clara held the door. "What can I do for you?" "I brought preserves for Mr. Walker," as a gesture. She extended the basket. "And I wanted to speak with you if I could." Clara looked at the basket, then at Margaret's face. She stepped back and let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, Clara on one side, Margaret on the other, the basket of preserves between them, like a small treaty neither party was sure would hold. "Thomas Caldwell came to speak with Henry," Margaret said. Directly, which surprised Clara. More directness than she'd expected. "2 days ago. He said things about you. About your time with the Caldwells, and about what happened with Mrs. Holt, and about why you came out here." "I know what he's saying," Clara said. "He's saying you manipulate people," Margaret said. "That it's what you do, that you find people who feel sorry for you, and you use that." She looked at Clara. Henry was disturbed by it. He's been wondering if he should say something to Mr. Walker, as a warning. Clara's chest was very tight. She kept her hands flat on the table. "Is that why you came?" she asked. "To tell me Henry is going to warn Nathaniel?" "No." Margaret shook her head. "I came because I wanted to look at you, in person, when no one's watching to see how you react." She studied Clara's face. "We put you out of that room," she said. "And I've wondered since then whether we should have. Whether Henry was too quick because Caldwell was already talking even then." Clara went still. "Even then," she repeated slowly. Margaret looked uncomfortable. "Caldwell had dinner with Henry's business partner sometime in September. Apparently your name came up. Nothing direct, nothing I could call a lie outright. Just questions, wondering aloud if you were quite what you seemed. September. 2 weeks after Clara had arrived at Walker Ranch. He hadn't come to Red Willow because he'd heard she was here. He'd already been laying the groundwork before she even found Walker Ranch. The realization moved through her like ice water. "He planned this before I even left Red Willow," she said. "I think so," Margaret said quietly. "I think Mrs. Holt's accusation was, I think someone put the idea in her head. Someone told her what to look for." Clara stared at the table. All this time she'd thought she'd ended up at Walker Ranch by accident. By the combination of her leg giving out and a fence post with a name on it, and a man who'd offered supper before he'd offered work. But Caldwell had been engineering her removal from the county, and Walker Ranch had been the one place far enough from town owned by a man independent enough that his reach hadn't landed there first. She had run directly away from him and directly into the one place he couldn't touch, and now he'd had to follow her here. Which meant she understood now that this place mattered more than she'd let herself admit. And it meant he knew it too. "Thank you," Clara said to Margaret, "for coming, for telling me." Margaret nodded, standing. "I'm sorry," she said. "For the room. For not saying anything sooner." She picked up the basket and seemed to change her mind and set it back down. "Keep the preserves." After she left, Clara sat alone in the kitchen. She thought about the packed bag, the unpacked bag, the Bible on the windowsill. She thought about a man who had spent years dismantling her life from a distance, quietly, systematically. The way a person takes apart a structure by removing the supports one by one until the whole thing comes down on its own. And she thought about Nathaniel Walker saying, "I am not going to let Thomas Caldwell walk into this county and rewrite what I know to be true." She had been afraid of staying. For the first time, she began to be afraid of leaving. Because if she left, Caldwell won. Not just here. He won the whole long story. He confirmed the version of her that he'd been selling to the world, the woman who came and went, who couldn't be trusted, who was always eventually moved on. She was so tired of being moved on. She was so tired of the packed bag. When Nathaniel came in that evening, she told him everything. Margaret's visit, the timeline, the things she'd worked out about Caldwell's movements. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. "He's not going to stop," she said. "I need you to understand that. He won't stop until he's damaged something, the ranch, your reputation, or me." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I think," Clara said carefully, "that I need to go into town. I need to speak to people directly. Briggs, the Hendersons, anyone Caldwell's been talking to. Not to argue, just to be visible. A real person is harder to turn into a story than an absent one." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "You'd go in alone." "I'd go in as myself," she said. "That's what he doesn't want. He wants me invisible, so the version of me he's built can fill the space." "I'm going with you," Nathaniel said. "Nathaniel, not to protect you." His voice was firm. "Because I choose to be there. There's a difference." She looked at him. "I know there's a difference," she said quietly. "Good," he said. "We go Friday." She nodded. She started to turn back to the stove. "Clara." She stopped. "Whatever he's done before," Nathaniel said, "whatever towns he's taken from you, he doesn't get this one." She didn't turn around because she couldn't trust her face right now. "No," she said. "He doesn't." And she meant it. For the first time in longer than she could measure, she meant it all the way down. Because somewhere between the unpacked bag and the Bible on the windowsill, and a man who said, "What do you want?" instead of, "Here's what you should do." Clara Whitmore had stopped performing the act of being unmoved. She was moved. She was very moved. And she was done letting Thomas Caldwell decide what that was worth. Friday was coming. And Clara Whitmore was not leaving this county. Not this time. Friday came with hard frost on the ground and a sky the color of old pewter. Clara was dressed and ready before anyone else in the house. She had chosen her best dress, which was not remarkable by any objective standard, but it was clean and pressed and fitted well enough, and she had spent enough years learning that the way you carried yourself into a room mattered more than what you wore into it. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee, and she breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she'd learned to breathe before difficult things. In, out. You have done harder things than this. James appeared first, which surprised her. He was not typically an early riser by choice. He was dressed properly, hat in hand, and when he saw her standing at the window, he gave her a look that was half admiration and half the particular nervousness of someone who cared about the outcome. "You look like you're going into battle," he said. "I'm going into town," Clara said. Same thing in this case. Nathaniel came in 2 minutes later. He looked at Clara. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything immediately, which was its own kind of language between them, now the silence that didn't need filling. "Ready," he said. Yes. They took the wagon. All three of them, which had not been discussed, but seemed to have been understood. James sat in the back. Nathaniel drove. Clara sat beside him, and she kept her spine straight, and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the road ahead, the same way she'd watched every road in her life, looking for what was coming before it arrived. The first stop was Briggs, the feed supplier. Nathaniel had sent word ahead, so Briggs was expecting them. He was a heavy-set man, practical and straightforward, the kind of man who had built his business on the understanding that reliable relationships were worth more than individual transactions. He looked at Clara when she walked in with a kind of reassessment, not hostile, just recalibrating. Clara shook his hand before he offered it. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I want to thank you for your patience with the account questions last week. I also want to be direct with you about something if I may. Briggs glanced at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing. That was deliberate. Clara knew he was giving her the room, not filling it for her. I'm aware that someone has been suggesting there are irregularities in Walker Ranch's accounts, Clara said. I want to show you the reconciled ledger if you're willing to look at it so that you can see exactly what was changed, why it was changed, and what the correct figures are. She set the ledger on his counter. I'd rather you judge the work than the rumor. Briggs looked at the ledger. He turned 3 pages. He looked up. Who told you there were questions? He said. A man named Caldwell, Clara said. I believe he spoke with you recently. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he said very deliberately, I didn't find the conversation useful. He closed the ledger and pushed it back toward her. Your accounts are in order, Miss Whitmore. Better order than they've been in years, if I'm honest. I'll say that to anyone who asks. Clara exhaled one careful breath. Thank you, she said, walking out. James fell into step beside her and said quietly, 1 down. Don't count, Clara said. It makes the remaining ones feel longer. The Hendersons were more delicate. Robert Henderson was 63 years old and had known Nathaniel's father, which gave him a particular kind of standing in his own mind, the standing of a man who felt entitled to opinions about the Walker family's choices. He received them in his front room with the studied politeness of someone who has already partially made up his mind and is waiting to see if you can unmake it. His wife Eleanor brought coffee without being asked. Clara noted that and filed it away as a small favorable sign. Henderson looked at Clara the way he might look at a contract clause he wasn't sure he trusted. You're the woman managing Walker's books, he said. I am. Changed our rate. I corrected it to reflect a number that's still 30% below current market value, Clara said. I can show you the market comparisons if you'd like to see them. I've farmed this county for 40 years, Henderson said. I know what things cost. Then you know the rate you were paying was what things cost in 1883, Clara said. Not unkindly, just directly. Henderson looked at Nathaniel. She always this straightforward, he said. Yes, Nathaniel said. Henderson turned back to Clara. Caldwell came to see me. Said you were pushing Nathaniel to squeeze the old relationships. Mr. Caldwell, Clara said, has a specific interest in removing me from Walker Ranch. I won't ask you to take my word for that. I'll ask you to look at the numbers and decide what they tell you. She placed the market comparison she'd prepared on the table between them. The relationship between Walker Ranch and the Henderson family has value that has nothing to do with me. I'd hate for it to be damaged by a man whose interest in damaging it begins and ends with me. Eleanor Henderson, who had been quietly present in the corner of the room, said, Robert, look at the paper. Henderson looked at his wife. There was 40 years of marriage in that look, the particular dynamic of 2 people who had over decades figured out whose judgment to defer to in which situations. He looked at the paper. He read it. Still below market, he said. Yes. By 30%. Yes. Henderson leaned back. He looked at Nathaniel. Your father would have liked her, he said. He had no patience for people who padded numbers. Nathaniel said, Neither do I. Henderson extended his hand to Clara. Arrangement stands, he said. You need anything from me, you write directly. Clara shook his hand. Her grip was firm. Eleanor walked them to the door and pressed Clara's hand briefly before she left one quick warm pressure that said more than most speeches Clara had ever heard. In the wagon heading toward the main street of Red Willow, James let out a long breath from the back. You're terrifying, he said. I mean that as a compliment. I know you do, Clara said. Nathaniel was quiet beside her, but she could feel it, the particular quality of his silence when he was carrying something he hadn't said yet. She'd gotten good at the varieties of his quiet. What? She said. I'm watching people see you, he said, the way I saw you the first day. She looked at him. It's something, he said simply. She turned back to the road before he could see whatever her face was doing. They were on the main street of Red Willow when Thomas Caldwell stepped out of the general store. It was not planned. Clara knew that immediately, the slight involuntary tightening of his expression when he saw them. The half-second of recalculation before his face settled into something composed and social. He had not expected to encounter them like this out in the open, all three of them together. Good, Clara thought. Let him recalculate. How was 30 years old and handsome in the way that men with money and confidence tend to be handsome, not through any particular gift of nature, but through the ease of never having doubted their right to take up space. He wore his coat well. He smiled with the facility of long practice. "Nathaniel," he said, extending his hand. "It's been a while." Nathaniel shook it. His grip, Clara knew, was very strong. His face was completely neutral. "Thomas," he said. Caldwell's eyes moved to Clara. They lingered there the way a man's eyes linger when he is trying to read how much the other person knows. She met his gaze without dropping it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Something behind the pleasantness there. "I didn't realize you were still in the area." "Funny," Clara said. "I thought you knew exactly where I was." A beat. The smile didn't move, but something behind it did. "I've heard you've been doing some work for Nathaniel," Caldwell said. "How enterprising of you." "She manages the ranch," Nathaniel said. His voice was even. "Accounts, operations, supply, relationships. She's done more in 2 months than the previous 3 years combined." "Is that so?" Caldwell tilted his head slightly. It was a patrician gesture, the slight inclination that suggested polite interest, while meaning something else entirely. "I hope it's working out. In my experience, Miss Whitmore has a gift for making herself seem indispensable in the short term." The street was not empty. 3 people stood within earshot, pretending not to listen. Clara knew this kind of moment, the public calculation, the statement designed to land where witnesses could hear it, but remain deniable in any direct confrontation. She had spent her life stepping back from these moments. She stepped forward. "Mr. Caldwell." She said, her voice clear and carrying without being raised. "You told Mrs. Holt in September that there was reason to question my honesty. You told the Hendersons last week that I was pressuring Nathaniel against his long-standing relationships. You told Mr. Briggs there were irregularities in accounts you have never seen." She kept her eyes on his face. "I'd like to ask you directly, and in front of anyone who cares to listen, to point to a single specific thing I have actually done wrong." The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that happens when a public space becomes very attentive. Caldwell's smile held. "I've only expressed concern," he said, "as a member of this community about—" "What specifically?" Clara said. "Be specific." His jaw tightened, barely visible. "I don't think a public street is the appropriate venue." "You chose the public venue," Clara said. "You've been choosing it for weeks. Every conversation you've had about me has been in public spaces to public audiences. So let's be public. What specifically have I done?" "Nothing." He said nothing because there was nothing to say. There never had been anything specific. That was the architecture of what he built, all implication, no foundation. And they both knew it. And now the 3 people on the street knew it too. Caldwell looked at Nathaniel with a smile that had gone cooler. "You've got yourself quite a spokeswoman, Nathaniel." "She speaks for herself," Nathaniel said. "Always has." Caldwell adjusted his coat. "Give my regards to your operation," he said, and walked away. James appeared at Clara's elbow from somewhere behind her. "I counted 4 people who heard that," he said quietly, "including Mary Sutton, who tells everything she hears to everyone in a 5-mile radius by nightfall." "I know who Mary Sutton is," Clara said. "This is going to be all over the county by Sunday." "That's the point," Clara said. She turned and walked back to the wagon, and her leg hurt, and she was shaking slightly in a way she hadn't let herself show on the street, and she was more alive than she'd felt in years. The ride back from Red Willow was quieter than the ride in, but differently quiet. Not tense, settled. The kind of quiet that happens after something difficult has been walked through and found survivable. James in the back of the wagon was the first to speak. "For the record," he said, "I want everyone to acknowledge that I was there for that." "We know you were there," Nathaniel said. "I just want it noted, historically, for posterity." Clara said nothing. But something that had been clenched tightly inside her all morning was slowly releasing like a fist opening one finger at a time. That night after supper, after James had gone to bed, Nathaniel came into the kitchen while Clara was finishing the evening dishes. He didn't say anything immediately. He sat at the table with his coffee, and she heard him put the cup down and then not pick it up again. "Tell me about the first town," he said. She turned. "What?" "The first town he took from you, before the Caldwell household, before Red Willow." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to, but I'd like to know." Clara dried her hands. She sat down across from him. She looked at the table for a moment at the grain of the wood at the lamplight moving across it. "Forsyth," she said. "I was 20. I had a position keeping accounts for a dry goods merchant named Albrecht. Good work. Fair man." She paused. "Thomas Caldwell came through town that summer with his father. He was 23. He decided I was interesting. I decided I was not interested." She said it flatly. He was not accustomed to that response. Nathaniel's hands flat on the table went very still. "He told Albrecht I had approached him inappropriately," Clara said. "That I'd made advances, and then when he declined, invented a pretext to cause trouble. Albrecht was a fair man, like I said. He asked me directly. I told him what had actually happened. He believed me." A pause. "Then Caldwell's father had a conversation with Albrecht's primary supplier. Albrecht couldn't afford to keep me after that." The silence was very complete. "That's the first one," Nathaniel said. "That's the first one," Clara confirmed. He was quiet for a long moment. "How many?" "3 towns," Clara said. "Before Red Willow, Forsyth, then Millbrook, then Caldwell territory, then Red Willow." She looked at her hands. "Every time I thought I was far enough away. Every time I thought I'd found something that would hold." "You are far enough away now," Nathaniel said. "You don't know that." "No," he said. "But I know that what happened today on that street is going to make it considerably harder for him to operate in this county the way he's been operating." He looked at her. "You took his weapon away. The implication only works when people haven't seen the real thing." Clara looked at him. "You saw him back down," Nathaniel said. "So did 4 other people, and by Sunday, 50 people will have heard about it. He spent 6 years building a version of you that doesn't exist. You put the real version in front of people today and let them choose." She felt something loosen in her throat. "I've never done that before," she said quietly. "Stood and made him be specific. Every other time I just left, or tried to defend myself in private where it didn't matter." "Why today?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Because I had something worth staying for," she said. The words came out before she'd decided to say them, and they landed between them on the table with all their weight and none of their complication resolved. Nathaniel didn't look away. "Clara," he said. "Don't." She shook her head. "Not tonight. I can't." She stopped. Started again. "I have spent a very long time not believing things would hold. I need just a little more time to trust this." He looked at her, that steady reading look. "All right," he said. He picked up his coffee cup. He drank. He set it down. "The accounts are current through October," he said. She blinked. "Yes." "Good. Start on November when you're ready." She stared at him for a moment. At this man who had just shifted without drama from the most vulnerable conversation she'd had in years, back to the ordinary business of the ranch. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood that what she needed right now was the ordinary. The continuous. The proof that tomorrow existed and looked the same as today. "I'll start on them tomorrow," she said. He nodded, stood, paused at the kitchen door. "For what it's worth," he said, his back still to her. "What you're worth was never in question. Not to me. Not from the first day." He left before she could answer. She sat in the kitchen alone and let herself feel every single thing she'd been holding at arm's length for 2 months. Let it move through her. Let it be what it was. And then she got up, put out the lamp, and went to bed. The Bible was on the windowsill. The hairbrush was on the hook. The bag was unpacked. She slept. The crisis came 9 days later, and it came in the form of fire. It started in the supply barn, a lantern they figured afterward knocked over by one of the horses during the night. By the time anyone woke to the smell of smoke, the fire had a 20-minute lead on them. It wasn't fully dark yet. Inside the barn, sparks had caught the hay storage, and the hay storage shared a wall with the grain bins, and grain bins in fire are not simply a supply problem. They are a catastrophe. The shout that woke the ranch was Pete's. He'd been doing a late check on the gray mare and had seen the first glow from the feed barn. He ran to the bunkhouse screaming, and within 3 minutes, every man on the ranch was awake and moving. Clara was awake before the shouting reached her. She'd heard something, not the fire, not yet, but something off in the pattern of the night that had pulled her out of sleep. By the time Pete was shouting, she was already at the window, and what she saw told her everything she needed to know about the next hour. She did not panic. This was one of the things she understood about herself, that in the moments when the ordinary order of things collapsed, she became clearer, not less. Some people fell apart when structure disappeared. Clara had spent so many years without structure that its absence was familiar territory. She was dressed and in the kitchen in under 2 minutes. She assessed what she knew: fire in the supply barn spreading. 14 ranch hands moving toward it. Nathaniel was already outside. She could hear his voice cutting through the noise. Buckets were being organized. Someone was already riding for the water pump by the creek. But there was something nobody was thinking about yet. The horses. Not the horses in the fire barn. Those were in the main barn across the yard. But if the fire spread to the grain bins, and the grain bins went up hard, sparks would carry. The wind tonight was coming from the southwest. The main barn was northeast of the supply barn. She ran, not toward the fire, toward the main barn. The horses inside could already smell it. She heard them before she reached the doors, that particular pitch of equine distress that travels straight down the spine. She got the main doors open, and inside it was chaos of a contained kind. 12 horses in various states of panic, pulling at their ties, rolling their eyes white. She went straight to the first stall. "Easy," she said, loudly and clearly. "Easy, I'm here. Easy." She worked fast. Not reckless fast with intention, which is different. She moved stall to stall, unlatching, talking, using her voice as a rope to pull their attention away from the fear. Her bad leg was screaming at her by the 4th stall. She ignored it the way she'd been ignoring it her whole life, filed the pain away in a drawer closed. The drawer kept moving. She got 8 horses out before Russ appeared at the barn doors. He stopped. He looked at what she'd done. He grabbed the next stall without saying a word, and then Pete was there too, and between the 3 of them, they had the remaining horses out in 7 minutes. Then Clara turned around and looked at the supply barn, and what she saw made her blood go cold. The fire was bigger than she'd thought, and it had not stopped at the supply barn. The connected bridge shed, the one with the winter medications for the cattle, the one with the equipment records going back years, the one with the spare parts that would take months to replace at this time of year. Its roof was beginning to catch, and in that shed was also 3 years of Nathaniel's account books, the originals. Everything before Clara had come and begun transferring records to the new system. She was moving before she'd consciously decided to. "Clara," Russ's voice sharp. "Clara, that roof's going." "The records are in there," she said, not stopping. "The records aren't worth—" "They're 3 years of accounts," she said. "Tax records, land agreements, everything before October." She got to the shed door. The heat was significant, not unbearable yet, but significant, and she knew the difference between significant and not yet dangerous would close fast. She went in. The records were in a wooden chest against the far wall. She knew exactly where because she'd inventoried this shed in her 3rd week. She crossed the floor in 12 steps, got the chest open, grabbed the ledger stack, and started back. The smoke was thicker than she'd expected. Her eyes stung. Her lungs objected. Her leg over the uneven floor caught on something, a shifted board, nothing dramatic, and she stumbled, caught herself on the wall, kept moving. She got out. She got out with the ledgers pressed against her chest, and her eyes streaming from the smoke and her leg on fire in a way that had nothing to do with the actual fire. Nathaniel was 10 feet from the shed door. She had not known he was there until she came out and nearly walked into him. He caught her by the arms, both hands firm and immediate, and the ledgers were between them, and he didn't even look at the ledgers. He looked at her face. "Are you hurt?" His voice was stripped of everything except the question. "I'm fine," she said. "Clara." "I'm fine. The records are intact." He looked at her for one long moment. His hands were still on her arms. She could feel the grip of them through her coat sleeves, not tight enough to hurt, just enough to be real. "You went in there," he said. "The records." "You went in there," he said again. Not angry. Something else. Something that wasn't anger, but that lived close to it in intensity. "I knew where they were," she said. "I knew how long I had. I calculated it." "Your leg is fine. Clara, you were limping before you went in." "I'm still limping now," she said. "It's not different." He looked at her for another moment. Then he took the ledgers from her arms, not roughly, just shifted them into his own, and he kept one hand on her elbow as he walked her back from the shed. She let him. Just this once. She let him. By morning, the supply barn was gone. The storage shed had lost its roof, but the walls had held, which meant the contents had been salvageable, what Clara had brought out and what the men had managed to get out after the roof started going. The main barn was intact. All 12 horses were accounted for, moved to the south paddock unsettled but unharmed. The assessment in the early cold light of the morning after was significant loss, not catastrophic. The supplies could be replaced. The structure could be rebuilt. Nothing irreplaceable was gone. Hector, who had been on ranches for 30 years and had seen more fires than he'd like to remember, put it plainly. It could have been the whole operation. It isn't because people moved fast and smart. He looked at Clara when he said it, not just at her directly, the way he'd been looking at her since the horses. Russ was beside him. Russ, who had made a bet in the second week that she wouldn't last. Russ, who had questioned whether she could carry the pots. Russ, who had handed her the bandaging for the mare's leg without being asked. Russ looked at her now and said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "She got the horses out, 8 of them before any of us got there, on that leg." Nobody said anything. I didn't need them to. Clara was sitting on a fence post, which was not dignified, but her leg had cashed in its patience sometime around 4 in the morning, and dignity was a lower priority than being able to stand upright by noon. She had coffee. James had appeared with it at some point, bless him, and she was watching the men assess the damage, and she was very, very tired. Nathaniel came and stood beside her. I didn't sit. There was still too much to manage, too many decisions to make, and she knew him well enough to know that standing was how he thought. But he stood close, and he was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was about to say something that mattered. "The ledgers are dry," he said. "Good. The records you pulled out, the 85 and 86 land agreements. I didn't have copies of those anywhere." "I know. That's why I went in." Another pause. "I've been doing this wrong," he said. She looked up at him. The ranch. Not the daily work, the planning. Looking too far ahead, not far enough. Not building reserves properly. He was looking at the burned-out barn, not at her. "You've been telling me this for 2 months in the numbers, and I've been hearing it, but I haven't been—" He stopped. "I need to restructure how we manage the winter reserves. If this had happened 2 months from now, we'd have been in serious trouble." "I know," Clara said. "I have some thoughts about that." "I know you do," he said. And the thing about that, the thing she noticed sitting on the fence post with her aching leg, and her smoke-dried eyes, and her coffee going cold in her hands, was the complete, uncomplicated certainty in his voice when he said it. "I know you do." Not a question. Not a courtesy. A fact he had filed away, and was now retrieving because it was useful. She had never been assumed capable before. She had been doubted, and then surprised. She had been pitied, and then reassessed. She had been tolerated, and then occasionally acknowledged. She had never simply been assumed. After you've slept, he said. And after that leg has rested. He looked at her finally, and there was something in his face that was more open than she'd seen it before. I'm serious about the leg, Clara. I saw you come out of that shed. It held, she said. This time. It always holds, she said. That's what it does. It hurts, and it holds. She looked at him steadily. Like most things worth having. He looked at her for a long moment. The ranch moved around them, men working voices calling the ordinary machinery of recovery beginning to turn. The sun was up now, pale and thin, and the cold was the particular cold of late November in Montana, and somewhere in the yard, James was arguing cheerfully with Pete about something, and losing, which was its natural state of affairs. The Winter Reserve Plan, Nathaniel said. What's your first recommendation? Clara almost smiled. This man. This impossible, infuriating, steady, decent man. Triple the grain supply before December, she said. And we need a secondary storage structure that isn't connected to the main supply barn. Separate fire risk entirely. He nodded. And, she said, you've been undervaluing the breeding stock on the inventory assessments by about 15%. We need to correct that before the January land review. He nodded again. Anything else? She looked at him. Give me a week, she said. I'll have a full winter plan ready. Good, he said. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly. Just a moment, the weight of it, and then walked back toward the damaged barn to begin the work of rebuilding. Clara sat on her fence post and held her cold coffee and breathed the cold air and looked at Walker Ranch at its burned edge and its intact heart, at its men working and its horses settling and its ordinary morning continuing against the backdrop of the night's disaster. And she felt something she had been circling for months finally land fully and without apology in the center of her chest. This was home. Not because it was perfect, not because it was safe, but because when it broke, she reached toward it instead of away from it. And because the man who ran it had put his hand on her shoulder, not to steady her, she didn't need steadying, but simply to say, without words, I know you're here. I'm glad you're here. She was glad she was here. She was done being surprised by that. The new supply barn went up in 3 weeks. Nathaniel put every available man on it, and Clara put the material costs into the revised winter plan she delivered on day 7, exactly as promised. And the two of them sat at the kitchen table going through it line by line, the way they had been sitting at that table, going through things for 3 months now, comfortably, efficiently, with the particular ease of two people who had learned each other's rhythms without ever formally deciding to. She had stopped noticing how natural it felt. That was the thing about belonging somewhere. It stopped announcing itself and simply became the air you moved through. James noticed, of course. James noticed everything and said most of it out loud, which was both his greatest quality and his most exhausting one. He had taken to arriving in the kitchen at odd hours and observing the two of them with the poorly concealed satisfaction of a man watching something he'd predicted come true. You're staring again, Clara said one morning without looking up from the accounts. I'm not staring, I'm appreciating. Go appreciate somewhere else. Clara. He sat down, dropping his elbows on the table. Can I say something? Can I stop you? Nathaniel hasn't looked at the road once since you got here. She looked up. What does that mean? It means every winter for 4 years by November, he starts getting quiet in a different way, looking at the road quiet, like he's expecting something to leave. James held her gaze. He hasn't done it once this year. Clara looked back at the accounts. James, she said, I'm just saying what I see. I know what you're doing, she said, and I need you to let it happen at its own speed. James was quiet for a moment. Then, fair enough. He stood, picked up an apple, headed for the door. Just don't let it happen so slow you miss it. He left before she could respond. She sat with the accounts and did not process a single number for 3 full minutes. Thomas Caldwell left Red Willow the 2nd week of December. Clara heard it from James first, who heard it from Mary Sutton, who apparently had sources everywhere. Caldwell had stayed longer than anyone expected, 10 days of diminishing returns. Each conversation he tried to have about Clara, meeting the same wall of people who had either been present on the main street that November morning or had heard about it in enough detail that the effect was the same. You cannot build a shadow version of someone in a town that has seen the real one standing in daylight holding her ground. He left without a goodbye to anyone, which was its own kind of answer. When Nathaniel told her, he said it plainly, the way he said most things. Caldwell's gone. He was at the counter pouring coffee, and he didn't turn around when he said it. Clara set down her pen. She sat with the information for a moment, feeling the shape of it, the end of something she'd been braced against for so long that bracing had become a posture she'd forgotten she was holding. Her shoulders dropped about half an inch. She hadn't known they were up. "All right," she said. Nathaniel turned. He looked at her face, reading it the way he always read it, carefully, without pressure. "All right," he said. "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would," she admitted. "I thought it would feel like winning something." "What does it feel like?" She considered. "Like putting down something heavy," she said. "You don't feel strong afterward. You just feel lighter than you expected." He nodded slowly. He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything for a moment, and in the silence she could hear the ranch outside, the ordinary sounds of it. Men working the horses in the rebuilt barn. The particular rhythm of a place that was alive and functioning, and hers to be part of. "I've been wanting to say something," Nathaniel said. Clara looked at him. "I've been trying to figure out the right way to say it for about 6 weeks, he said, "which is longer than it takes me to make most decisions, so you can draw your own conclusions about what that means." Her heart was doing something she was choosing not to name. "Say it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "When Miriam left, I decided something was broken in me. Not dramatically. I didn't fall apart. I just decided that was a door that closed, and I built the rest of my life on the other side of it." He paused. "I've been running this ranch for 11 years on the principle that work is enough, that the land and the cattle and the men and the seasons, that if I did the work well enough, I wouldn't need to want anything more." "Nathaniel, I'm getting there," he said with the smallest edge of dry humor that made her want to smile despite herself. She waited. "You walked up my road in October with a bad leg and 1,047, and more dignity than anyone I've ever met," he said. "And I told myself I was offering you work because the ranch needed it," which was true. A pause. It wasn't the whole truth. The kitchen was absolutely quiet. "I saw you," he said simply. "Before you said a single word, before I knew anything about you. I looked at you standing in the yard, and something in me recognized something." He shook his head slightly, as if the imprecision bothered him. "I know how that sounds." "It doesn't sound foolish," Clara said quietly. "No. No." She held his gaze. "Because I felt it too. And I spent 3 months telling myself I was imagining it." A long breath moved through the room. "Were you?" he said. "No," she said. "I wasn't." He looked at her for a moment, that reading look, the one she'd catalogued 100 times, the one she'd learned meant he was making a decision that he would not reverse. "I'm not asking you to stay because the ranch needs you," he said. "The ranch does need you, but that's not why I'm asking." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. Just his large, weathered hand over her smaller one. No performance, no preamble. "Stay because you want to. Stay because this is yours too. Stay because I would rather spend the next 40 years arguing about ledger entries with you than spend them alone managing things correctly, but without—" He stopped. "Without what?" she said. Her voice was very careful. "Without someone who knows what the work is worth," he said. "Not the money, the actual worth." Clara looked at his hand over hers. She thought about the packed bag, the unpacked bag, the Bible on the windowsill, the hairbrush on the hook, every town she had left, every door that had closed, every version of herself she had quietly folded away when the world made it clear there was no room for it. She thought about a woman who had been called Charity, a woman who had bent to pick up thrown coins from a floor with her spine straight and her face still. A woman who had walked 4 miles on a screaming leg because there was no other direction available and ended up somewhere she didn't know she'd been looking for. She turned her hand over under his and held it. "I already stayed," she said. I made that decision when I unpacked the bag." He looked at her. "I just needed you to catch up," she said. Something moved across Nathaniel Walker's face that she had never seen there before, open and unguarded and young in a way that had nothing to do with age. He let out a slow breath, and the last 11 years of distance moved out with it. "I'm caught up," he said. The twist came from a direction neither of them expected, and it came on a Sunday. The letter arrived in the Morning Post, delivered by the same writer who brought the weekly news from Billings. It was addressed to Clara Whitmore, care of Walker Ranch, in a handwriting she did not immediately recognize. She opened it at the kitchen table. It was from Douglas Caldwell, Thomas's father. She read it once, then again. Then she set it down and sat very still. Nathaniel came in from outside, read her face and sat down immediately. "What is it?" "Douglas Caldwell," she said. "Senior." She pushed the letter across the table. He read it. His expression moved through several things. The letter was formal, measured, and entirely unexpected. Douglas Caldwell was 61 years old and had spent 4 decades building an empire on the understanding that his name was currency. The letter said in the careful language of a man who was not accustomed to this particular exercise that he had become aware of actions taken by his son that did not reflect the values of his household. That he had reviewed the relevant history. That Miss Whitmore was owed an acknowledgement that the accusations against her character in Forsyth, in Millbrook, and in Red Willow had been without merit and had originated with Thomas without his father's knowledge or authorization. It was not quite an apology. It was as close to one as that kind of man knew how to write. And at the bottom, in slightly different ink added later, she could tell was one more line: "Thomas will not be returning to this county. You have my word on that." Nathaniel set the letter down. He looked at Clara. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like the last piece of something very heavy finally let go," she said. "And also, like it doesn't change what happened." "No," he said. "It doesn't." "But it changes what comes next," she said. He nodded. "Yes, it does." She picked up the letter and folded it precisely the way she folded everything, clean edges exact. She set it aside. She looked at the accounts on the table, at the winter plan, at the organized and functional evidence of 2 months of good work. "I want to write back," she said. "All right. Not with anger. I don't have any anger left for him." She paused. "I want to tell him that I accept the acknowledgement, and that it matters even if it can't undo what was done. And then I want to be finished with the Caldwells entirely." "Good," Nathaniel said. She wrote the letter that afternoon. 3 paragraphs. Measured and honest and utterly final. She did not perform graciousness. She didn't feel, and she did not perform bitterness that had already burned itself out. She simply said what was true. The acknowledgement was received. It was meaningful. It was the end of the matter. She sealed it and handed it to James to post, and when she walked back into the kitchen, she felt the door close behind her on 6 years of something she'd been carrying without being able to set down. Spring came to Walker Ranch, the way it always came to Montana, late, sudden, and extravagant, as if apologizing for how long it made everyone wait. The rebuilt supply barn was finished and fully stocked by February. The January land review had gone cleanly with the corrected assessments Clara had prepared. The breeding stock numbers held. 3 new contracts for grazing rights properly priced came in before March. Walker Ranch was not just surviving, it was expanding, carefully, sustainably, with a plan that looked 2 years ahead and accounted for variance the way a good plan always should. The county noticed. Hector, who had been ranching in Montana for 3 decades and had an opinion on everything and kept most of them for himself, said one morning to no one in particular, and everyone within earshot, "I've worked for 4 different operations. This one's the best run I've seen, and I've been here long enough to know it wasn't always." He was looking at Clara when he said it. She looked back at him and said, "The men run it well." "The men do their jobs," Hector said. "That's different from running it well." Russ, walking past, said nothing. But he met Clara's eyes and nodded once, that particular nod she'd first seen from him in the early weeks, the one that had started from reserve and had traveled over months into something that looked a great deal like respect. Women in the county began finding reasons to come to Walker Ranch. Not officially, not dramatically, just the ordinary traffic of frontier life neighbors, dropping by questions about supply sources, the gradual social acknowledgement that this was a place worth knowing. Some of them had whispered about Clara once. Some of them had not. None of them mentioned it, and Clara didn't require them to. She was more interested in what came next than what had been. Children from 2 neighboring homesteads had started appearing on Saturday mornings because Clara had, without making a particular announcement about it, begun going over simple accounts with them at the kitchen table, numbers and letters, and the basic tools that made the difference between a life that was managed and a life that managed you. She hadn't been asked to do this. She'd simply noticed 2 children who were bright and had no particular access to education and done the practical thing. Nathaniel had come home one Saturday to find 4 children at his kitchen table, with Clara deep in a lesson about multiplication. He had stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he'd gone quietly to pour himself coffee and sat in the corner and read until they were finished, and when the children left he said, "How long has this been happening?" 3 Saturdays, Clara said. "You could teach properly," he said. "There's no school teacher within 12 miles. "I know. Is that something you'd want?" She thought about it. About the little girl she'd been, the one who had learned numbers from her mother's Bible accounts and never had enough access to the tools she could feel her mind reaching for. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." "Then we'll build a proper space for it," he said. "In the spring." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said, in the voice he used when she was about to argue herself out of something she deserved. "I want to. There's a difference." She had learned over the months to stop arguing with that particular sentence. On an evening in late April, after the dinner, things were cleared, and James had gone to play cards with the ranch hands, and the house was quiet with the specific quality of quiet that 2 people make together when they have stopped performing ease and simply arrived at it. Nathaniel came out to the porch where Clara was standing. She heard him come out. She didn't turn around. He stood beside her in the dark, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was one of the things she loved most about him, that the silence between them had never needed filling. "I have been thinking," he said finally. "About what?" "About the fact that you have been here 7 months, and you still haven't asked me anything about the future." She turned to look at him. "I was waiting," she said. "For what?" "For it to feel like mine to ask about," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark, and she watched his face do the thing it did when he was about to say something he had decided on fully and intended to mean completely. He took her hand, not like the first time, not over the table, with the careful weight of something being confessed. Like something that simply belonged there, the way the evening belonged to the ranch, and the ranch belonged to Montana. And some things are simply in the right place, and you know it not by logic, but by the feeling that fighting it would be fighting something truer than yourself. "Clara Whitmore," he said, "you walked up my road with nothing, and you built something here that was better than what I'd managed in 11 years alone." He held her hand and looked at her the way he had looked at her from the very first day. Not at the limp, not at the history, not at the weight of what the world had tried to make her carry. At her. "I am asking you to stay. Not as the woman who manages the accounts. Not as the woman who saved the horses and pulled the records from a burning building and faced down Thomas Caldwell in the middle of the street." He paused. "As mine, and I as yours, equally and without condition." Clara felt every year of the long road that had led here. Every closed door, every packed bag, every town that had told her she was not enough, not right, not the kind of person who got to stay. She felt all of it, and she let it mean what it meant. Not nothing, not everything, but the true and accurate weight of a life that had been hard and was hers. And she looked at this man, steady, stubborn, decent, direct, and she said what was simply, finally, completely true. "You told me when I first came here that I didn't need someone to fix me, that I needed someone who knew my worth." She held his gaze. "You were right. And you have been that person every day since." She squeezed his hand. "So yes, I will stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because there is nowhere else I want to be." He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, and the quiet around them was the best kind, the kind that holds something instead of hiding it. She had spent her whole life searching for a place where she could simply be who she was and have that be enough. She had found it. Not because the world had changed and decided to be fair. Not because someone had rescued her from herself. But because she had kept walking through every closed door, every thrown coin, every town that turned her away, and she had been stubborn enough and brave enough, and when it mattered most honest enough to reach toward the thing that was real. The girl that everyone ignored had become the woman that no one here could imagine being without. And Clara Whitmore, who had once walked 4 miles on a broken road with a broken leg, and $1.47, and the last remaining dignity of a person who refuses to stop, finally, completely, and without apology, came home. Some people are not lost. They are simply on the way to where they have always belonged.